Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we're getting started here. Well, welcome to the first of 4 Western Cover Crops Council's Intermountain Subregional Conference from the Ground Up webinars. My name is Steve Hines, and I'm an extension educator for University of Idaho, and I'm located in Jerome County, which is in the south central part of the state. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today as we introduce the Western Cover Crops Council and begin learning about cover crops work in the region. It's taken much effort to get to this point, and I would quickly like to recognize the other members of the Intermountain Subregional Conference team to you. Claire Sullivan is an extension educator with Oregon State University. Jason Thomas is an extension educator with the University of Idaho, and he's the man responsible for the technology to make all of this happen. Lauren Golden is the program coordinator for this project, and you'll hear from her a little bit later today. And Soren Newman is a senior researcher with the University of Idaho who's helped us with the evaluation part of this conference. And of course, we have to thank Western SARE for the funding for the grant to make all of this project possible. We have prepared a brief evaluation survey for each of the 4 sessions, and these are different than the pre-conference survey that we asked you to fill out. Please help us today by taking a few minutes and filling out the survey after each session. This will help us evaluate the sessions, and it will give us the ability to report programming impacts to our various universities and to SARE as well. The link will be in the chat box, and I will mention this again at the end of the session today again, so that you can click on that link and please take that survey for us. We know that it takes some of your time to do that, but we really do appreciate the input. So you'll probably notice that we have all of the cameras and microphones off and muted. This is a webinar format. If you have questions, please type those into the chat box. And at the end of each presentation, we'll take a couple of questions. In the interest of time today, realistically, we probably won't get to all of those. If you have a burning question, you can email me at shines@uidaho.edu. And I've already put my email in the chat box for you. So email me your questions and I will pass those along to the appropriate speaker today. I would now like to introduce the first of the speakers today for the first presentation, Jeremy Allen and Matt Yost. Jeremy Allen is a second career, first generation farmer based in Bend, Oregon. After working almost 15 years in clinical medicine, he felt he'd do more good for human health and improving ecology by jumping into the growing regenerative agriculture movement. His farm, 5 Kingdom Farms, is an homage to the 5 kingdoms of life, where he and his family focus on soil building, regenerative grazing practices, fungal cultivation, and of course, cover crops innovation. He's passionate about getting more green into your life. And his co-presenter, Matt Yost. Dr. Matt Yost is a native of Southern Idaho, where he was raised on a dairy farm. He completed his master's and PhD in applied plant sciences at the University of Minnesota, working on nutrient management in corn after alfalfa. After completing his PhD, he spent 4 years doing postdoctoral research at the US Midwest, working advancing precision nutrient management and conservation. His current position is as an Agroclimate extension specialist with Utah State University, where he began in 2017. The focus of his current research and extension is on water optimization and agriculture through precision water, soil, and crop management. He has authored numerous journal and extension articles on research dealing with nitrogen management, water optimization, precision agriculture, soil conservation, and bioenergy crops. So Jeremy.
All right, are we working? We live here?
Sounds good.
Cool. Hey, everybody. I'm going to try to share my screen here and get the presentation going.
There you go.
Is that better?
Yep.
All right, perfect. Oh, technology. All right, so here we are. Cover crops, the Western Cover Crops Council and you. This is an introduction. This was a double rainbow we had on the farm. You can't not have a double rainbow to start off your presentation. So the Western Cover Crops Council was the last region of the SARE regions to form. We got grant funding to start ourselves off, and then now we'll start running independently, although not until we've used up all of our grant money, of course. The board of directors was founded in November of 2019. And then we elected officers in March of 2020. And as the only farmer on the council and the board of directors, I think I got railroaded into being the president. And as any farmers who are paying attention know, all the academics think we do is just sit around watching plants grow and animals eat. So, you know, why not let me head one of the biggest challenges that we have, which is managing a huge area of land to start getting people to use more cover crops. But I'm up for it, and it sounds like it's fun for me. We are the largest landmass covered out of all of the SARE regions. We're 1.8 million miles, so 1.8 million square miles. Of course, I'd like to give a shout out to Alaska, which in this map is only showing it about the same size as Washington, which is really more like this size. So thanks, Alaska. We're the most important now, of course. The other thing that's really important to mention is that we have a diverse biomes and ecoregions, and this is a USDA map right here showing all of the small ecoregions. And where we're talking about specifically, you see there's a whole number of them. And you know, as the mountains play a role, people have their own unique altitude and weather and growing season and sunlight. So this is kind of a real big challenge, but the Western Cover Crops Council is up for the task. The biggest thing that we have to offer people is that we have a great website, and that website's still in development, but we're getting it going now. And you can visit it at www.westerncovercrops.org. We kind of, you may notice if you check out ours compared to the other cover crop councils, that our website looks a little different. We're trying to be innovative here. And we went with this kind of idea that everybody involved can appreciate plants. And so using the plant as the kind of common ground between all of the people, the researchers, the farmers, the seed developers, we can find that. So I always encourage people to come on over to the website, check it out, explore it. Feel free to reach out to us, and you'll find that you have local regional members as well. The mission of our Cover Crop Council is to facilitate and enhance communication and collaboration that promotes the successful adoption and integration of cover cropping into the Western U.S. agricultural systems, which is a mouthful. And really all we're really trying to say is grow more plants. And by this, we mean grow more diversity of plants on your farm, grow more types of plants, grow pre-crop and post-crop, and then of course across time. So whenever you have anything possibly growing under land that you control, we hope that you'll be growing something. The reason is because now cover crops, they're not really a solution, but they're more of a tool. This isn't the one big fix that'll fix everyone's farming woes, but it's a tool that we use. And so one of the most important things we like to point out is that if you don't pick the plants, nature will. And we spend a lot of time and energy fighting weeds, when in fact we could be choosing the species that we would be planting. The next thing is that living roots in the ground equal healthier soil. And there's going to be a lot of presentations about a lot of this stuff. But the big focus from the Western Cover Crops Council's perspective is we want to get people in through the door and know that cover crops can be something that you can be integrating into your farm. The more microbiology that you want in your soil, they live in the apartment complexes that are the roots of your plants. So the more plants you have growing and the less fallow land that you have, the better off your soil will be. Biology trumps chemistry, and this is just an idea that we don't really know everything, but nature's been doing this a lot longer than we have. And the more that we emulate nature, the better off we are. And we've kind of been led down this path to focus only on chemistry, on potassium and nitrogen, when in fact it's a lot more complex than that. And as you probably all know, zooming out a little bit and getting more towards the plant life and then letting the fungi and the bacteria doing their thing is kind of a greater focus for us. And then the last thing I would point out is that the improved economics. Of course, everybody wants to know that they'll make more money, and it's a short-term and a long-term solution. It decreases farm inputs and it increases farm outputs. And that's a double reason that we should be incorporating more cover crops into the toolbox of our farm program. Of course, a lot of people here, and I get this all the time, say, yeah, but this doesn't really apply to me. And to that, I usually ask, can you grow plants on your farm? And people always tell me, yes, plants grow on your farm. And that's all you need to get in. If things can grow on your farm, then you can get into cover cropping. I mean, if Matt Damon can fly to Mars and grow potatoes with Martian sand and his poop, then you too can farm. cover crops. So, and I will throw out the USDA has told me to say that you should not poop on your fields. That's pretty much it from me here. I've got some cool pictures. This is a cover crops from my field. We've got a purple top turnip with some little mushrooms growing off the side. Off to the right, we've had a significant increase in the predatory insect life. So we've got a European mantis there, if you can see them blending in. And then of course, in the middle, one of my favorite terms I've ever encountered in my program is that I terminate by scythe. So we get rid of a lot of our cover crops with scything here. But yeah, so that's what we've got. I think we'll turn it over to Matt, or I don't know if we're going to do questions for me, but there we are. Welcome to the Western Cover Crop Council.
Thanks, Jeremy. We'll take questions after Matt is finished.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, Steve, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Jeremy, thank you for that great introduction into the Western Cover Crop Council. Appreciate that, and appreciate your leadership to the council. It's great to have input and involvement and leadership from the people actually using and incorporating cover crops into their operations. So thank you. I today just want to give a quick announcement of one component of the Western Cover Crop Council and leave you with an invitation. Jeremy mentioned that the Western Cover Crop Council covers a very large geography, as you can see. And as you look across this geography, you quickly will notice that there is a huge diversity in the types of cropping systems that are present in this region. You don't have to go far from Central California to the northern part of Montana. You'll see a very different climate, very different crops that are being produced, and different applications of cover crops. For that reason, the Western Cover Crop Council has decided to incorporate regional committees so that we can focus on regions that may have similar climates, similar cropping systems, similar concerns, opportunities for cover crops, to try to build another level into the efforts and the leadership to focus on regional specific issues and applications. So there's 4 regions that have been developed within the Western Cover Crop Council, and you can see those here on the map. Each of these regions is forming a committee, and these committees are consist of 5 to 10 people that would represent that region and try to coordinate the activities and the responsibilities of that region. Each region has a chair of the committee that will kind of help organize and lead efforts of the committee. Currently, I serve as the committee chair for the Mountain Range Committee, as you can see in green. We are just starting to form this committee, and so we're looking for interested participants to get involved. Okay, so if you were involved in the Mountain Range Committee, what would your responsibilities be? What would you do? Here are a few things that you would do as a part of this committee. The first couple are to support the Western Cover Crop Council Board of Directors, the main board of directors that represents the whole Western United States. You would also help to direct regional Western Cover Crop Council activities. The ultimate goal of the Western Cover Crop Council and of each of these committees is to help producers, help others in the industry have the knowledge, tools, skills that they need to assess and incorporate cover crops into their operations. And so that ultimately that's what these regional committees are trying to do is promote the wise stewardship of cover crops in their region. So in order to do that, some of the things that these committees would do would be to highlight and share cover crop innovations or success stories, collaborate on grant funded projects so that we can develop research and education outreach focused on cover crops. Also, as a part of the committee, help develop ideas for research and education grant proposals that would increase adoption related to the last topic. Also discuss some of the successes and the challenges with cover crop adoption, research and education. And then there's opportunities to contribute to larger efforts of the Western Cover Crop Council as a part of their website, social media, and other avenues. And so I'll leave with an invitation. We're currently trying to form this committee. We're looking for 5 to 10 participants and for a range of participants that would include farmers, industry folks, university, government agency folks, just a wide variety of people that are interested in cover crops. So if you live or farm or work in Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, or New Mexico, and you have interest in being involved with the Mountain Range Committee and with the Western Cover Crop Council, we would love to have you. If you're interested, you can reach out to me at my email, which is easy. It's just matt.yost@usu.edu, and I'll provide it when I present later. You can also go to the Western Cover Crop Council webpage and click on regional committees. Underneath regional committees, you'll see the Mountain Range Committee, and you can easily email or contact me through the website as well. So with that, I'll leave you that invitation, and we would love to have you if you're interested. Okay, thank you.
All righty, thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. And I know that there was a question about, well, our state, we would really fit in this other one a little bit better. And that's certainly true. In fact, the board had quite a discussion sometimes back about, do we go with these eco-climate kind of regions, or do we go with state borders? And, you know, you look at the Western United States, and my gosh, between the Central Valley of California and the Pacific Islands and Alaska, we have quite a bit of variation. So that's kind of where we're at this point. So anyway, with that, we do have time for a couple of questions.
If you have a question, the best thing to do is click on the Q&A. There is a Q&A section you can click on, and then you can ask a question, or you can upvote other questions. But I do see a question in the chat from Kathy Noble.
Yeah, Kathy, this is Jeremy talking here. Like Steve just mentioned, we went back and forth about, do we section ourselves up based off of ecoregion or biome, or do we focus on state borders? We ultimately stuck to state borders mostly because of kind of bureaucratic reasons and not natural reasons at all. You do not have to be in one of those states to be part of that region. I strongly encourage people who find that a region is more like theirs. For example, the mountain region. I'm in Central Oregon, which is nothing like Western Oregon. We're high altitude desert, although I'm a little embarrassed to say high altitude around a lot of the mountain folk here. We're only at 3,500 feet. But the point is, you know, growing here is a lot more like Idaho or Montana or Wyoming than it is like just a different part of my own state. So I strongly encourage people to join any kind of subcommittee that reflects what they'd be growing and knowledge that they'd be using.
All right, thank you. And Jason, I did see Barry had his hand raised.
Okay, Barry,
Can we
you should be allowed to ask your question if you had a question you're willing to ask. Maybe he just raised his hand on accident. So there is a question in the Q&A. And this one's for you, Jeremy. It's from Kate Graham. She says, Jeremy, what is the acreage that you terminate with scythe?
Oh, yeah. The scythe, it's a fun talking point for sure. I probably terminate under 5 acres with a scythe across the entire year. We mostly graze our cover crops down. That's how we kind of terminate here. I usually use the scythe when I also have pastured chickens. And so that's usually how I integrate that. What the chickens don't manage, or how I want to bring some cover crop to them wherever they are. So I have my farm's 60 acres. I definitely don't scythe the whole thing. I'll never let anyone think that. I'm also a big fan of flail mowing. So those are kind of my termination techniques.
Okay, and I see Barry asked his question in the question and answer, which I think maybe Jeremy just slightly touched on, but he said, neither Jeremy nor Matt have mentioned livestock as part of the soil health issue.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm introducing just the Western Cover Crop Council. I think there's going to be a lot of conversations about livestock integration. This is, from my perspective, and also based off of research, animal integration into plant-based systems is a critical component to regenerative agriculture. So that's how we get rid of almost all of our cover crops, is through grazing with the cattle and with chickens. So I think it's probably this is my opinion. I think it's the best way to get rid of cover crops. You'll see a lot of talks about that. And then I'll be presenting for the Pacific Northwest version of this, which I encourage everyone to come to as well. And we'll be talking about our farm specifically and how we graze.
Right, Barry, that's a good point. And, cover crops are one aspect of soil health. And there's lots of other aspects, incorporating livestock and eliminating tillage, crop diversity. There's lots of other things that are involved in soil health and are important and need to be addressed. The Cover Crop Council really has a large focus on cover crops, but at the same time, I think we're also trying to coordinate and combine and work with other efforts as well. Kind of a larger regenerative ag effort and a larger soil health effort that's happening in various ways across our region. So yeah, great question, great thing to keep in mind. We are trying to synchronize what we do within the council with other larger efforts.
Yeah, good, thank you. And of course, if you look at next week's agenda, I think a lot of the presentations will really start digging into kind of the meat of cover crops and the relation to soil health and some of those types of things. So there was one final question, unless there's one in the chat, on question and answer. Will much of this relate to high desert in Arizona? And I guess I'll let Jeremy or Matt answer that.
You got it, Matt?
So as we've we've discussed, that this region is so diverse, and we've got lots of different ecoregions and systems represented, and it will be hard to address all of them, but we're going to do our best to focus on principles and tools and other resources that are hopefully will help as many people as possible. So some of the concepts and principles will apply everywhere, right? What things to think through if you're considering a cover crop, and what to look at, economics or other considerations or types of cover crops. So some of that will be generally applicable and hopefully useful to all areas. But there is, and there'll always be things that are specific to each region, and so in each system, like Northern Arizona. And so I guess at this point, I'd say, try to get involved. If you've got specific concerns or needs in your area, reach out to someone inside of your region. I showed you that website. It's easy to go on and find your region and leave a note, leave a comment, get a hold of somebody inside of your region and let them know what your specific needs are. And I I think that committee, that group will try to do what they can to help you.
Yeah, I would add on by just saying, yes, Terry, yes, this absolutely applies to you. This applies to every single person watching this. If you have control of land, cover cropping is something that you should be incorporating. The details, exactly like Matt just mentioned, the details come from your local people, your local extension agents, NRCS, reaching out to us at the Western Cover Crop Council. That's how you'll find which species to use. Hey, what kind of vetch do I use? I don't know what kind of vetch you use. Maybe woolly pod, maybe it's hairy. That's when you talk to your local people. I think the big, we want you through the door knowing that cover crops in general are going to be something that you can absolutely apply to your farm. If you're growing plants on your farm, you can be cover cropping. And I'm seeing a couple other questions popping up here to answer them really fast. Rich, yes, we have a Pacific Northwest region. Stay tuned for that. You can join us. If you come onto the Western Cover Crop Council website, we'll give you the information that way. And Linda, I see that you're mentioning that, yep, you're also high altitude. And, you know, that'd be a local question for your local people who know your biome specifically. Nutrient density produce. Yes, Barry, 100%. That's why I left clinical medicine and became a farmer, which parents aren't very excited about. You leave a medical career to go be a farmer, but that's exactly why I'm doing this, to improve nutrient density in food.
All right, folks, I think we better move on to our next presenter here. Great bunch of questions, and really appreciate your interest. And again, if you have some questions that did not get answered, just please feel free to go ahead and email those to me, and I will get those again to the appropriate speaker. So for our second presentation today, cover crop use in the Intermountain West and Northern Rockies, a regional survey result, I'd like to introduce Lauren Golden. Lauren spent 10 years as an extension educator with the University of Idaho, where she focused on sustainable soil management. While focusing on cover crops and high desert farming systems, Lauren went on to pursue a PhD in public policy and administration. She is now completing her dissertation, which focuses on cover crop use in the West and the policies in place that incentivize farmers to adopt conservation practices. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for that introduction, Steve, and thank you all for joining us today on this webinar and the following webinars. We hope we get to see you as well. To tag on to Jeremy and Matt's presentation, the Western Cover Crops Council in 2020 embarked on a survey to understand use of cover crops in the West. And this was part of a Western SARE funded project. So essentially, the Midwestern Cover Crop Council and the Northeast Cover Crop Council had done some similar surveys to garner data on how many people in those regions were using cover crops. And essentially in the West, there really was not a data set that kind of encompassed how many farmers in the West were using cover crops, what motivated farmers to use cover crops, and more importantly, what were some of the barriers to this region? As highlighted, it's a very diverse, large region, and the way we use cover crops is different than areas in the Midwest and in the Northeast. So with my time with you today, I'm going to share some of our survey results. So, how can we produce more food on less land with less resources? So essentially, this is the wicked problem facing the agriculture industry. We know that growing populations will require us to produce more food. We know that viable land is declining and soil health is declining on that land. And we know we need to do it with less resources. And we know even on an individual level, we need to make decisions that look at our carbon footprint. Well, to tag on to that, data suggests that agriculture is the #1 contributor of non-point source pollution in US waterways. Now, that has been most evident in large water bodies such as the Chesapeake Bay or the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where this image is seen. And in some summers, that dead zone can be as large as the state of New Jersey. And we all know that industry and homeowners also add to that nitrogen and phosphorus levels in our water, but essentially agriculture is the #1 contributor of that. To add to that, we know climate change threatens the world's food supplies, which means farmers are constantly facing new norms, which means farmers are having to reevaluate their management systems and management plans. Now we know water quality, and why we're concerned about non-point source pollution is not only does it impact water for our own human consumption, but we know it has degradation on aquatic ecosystems. Well, I bring that all up because that brings us here today, which Jeremy so pointedly talked about. Cover crops are not necessarily the panacea of solving some of those agricultural issues that I just mentioned, but cover crops are essentially the best tool in our toolbox. Now, that's because cover crops do a variety of things. Most of us in this room are probably familiar with some of those benefits, but I'll mention a couple. The conversation after mine will highlight data has shown that in some cases, cover crops can increase soil moisture, which is important for the West. We know that cover crops add organic matter and an organic source of nitrogen to our soils. We know that cover crops can reduce erosion by improving soil structure and having a material on the ground to eliminate soil movement. We know cover crops can reduce soil compaction through their roots. And most importantly, we know that cover crops can help reduce leaching, essentially of the inputs we add to our farm. Cover crops can help essentially slow or eliminate that leaching process. Now, cover crops have received considerable attention by not only ag professionals, but farmers like yourself and the federal government for the reason that cover crops are so effective at reducing non-point source pollution. And to deal with non-point source pollution on such a large scale, when it's like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico or the Chesapeake Bay, it's essentially cost prohibitive. So the best case scenario is to help prevent leaching on each individual farm, which is why cover crops are so heavily pushed within the United States Department of Ag. So the Western Cover Crops Council, as you all learned about, as well as all of you in this room, we're all pretty enthusiastic about cover crops and the potential they can have for not only farmers, but also on a large societal scale in terms of helping to improve some of the environmental issues associated with producing food. So with my time with you today, I'm going to highlight how we conducted our survey, and then I'm going to jump right into the survey results, which essentially was, what's the rate of cover crop use in the West? What motivates farmers to use cover crops in the West? What are some of the barriers seen by farmers in the West? How do farmers access information about cover crops? And then I'm going to end with policy in terms of looking at how the federal government incentivizes some of these programs through a cost share cover crop program. So essentially we asked a digital survey via Qualtrics, and it was about 60 questions, and it ran from April to June of 2020. So we were luckily able to capitalize on that first stay-at-home order for a lot of people in the US. So we were fortunate to have a decent response rate. We had over 900 farmers respond to this survey, which is a good response rate for a survey of this size. Essentially, it took about 10 to 15 minutes for each farmer to complete. We sent this survey out to farmers in the West. And if you think of that, about that map that Jeremy showed, those blue states, those are essentially the Western region that we targeted. And we advertised this survey through Facebook. We use agricultural listservs. We used our network within the Western Cover Crops Council, and we used various agricultural organizations that were essentially willing to share that survey link in their newsletters or various email blasts. So let's jump right into our survey results. So baseline data, cover crop use in the West. Essentially, we asked farmers, have you ever used cover crops before? Yes or no. And good information was found. We found that 72% of respondents indicated they had used cover crops before or perhaps regularly used them, whereas only 28% of farmers in the West indicated they had never used cover crops before. Now, I'm going to tease out that data and just focus on this mountain range, or essentially Idaho, or excuse me, the Intermountain West / Northern Rockies zone, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and Nevada. And we found similar results. About 68% of those farmers indicated they had used cover crops or have used them before. So all in all, this was good data to find that we can say that around 70% of Western farmers have used cover crops or are regularly using them. And that's a good starting off point as we look to continue to expand cover crop use in the West. Now, we also asked farmers how many acres of cover crops they had planted in the period between 2016 and 2020. So the good news is this bar graph indicates that, or this line chart indicates that the acreage is going up. The earliest data point was 2016, where we asked how many acres did you produce? And farmers indicated they produced around 30,000 acres. And now we can see in 2020, those same respondents have upped their acreage by more than 20,000. The mean acreage for survey respondents was 850 acres. We had some small scale farmers with 1 to less than 10 acres. And then we had some very large scale farmers with indicating they had farmed 50,000 acres. So the mean was around 850 acres. And the good news is we can see that that acreage is increasing. Next in the survey, we asked what motivates farmers in the West to use cover crops. I mentioned some of the benefits that we all know about, but we essentially asked respondents to rank on a Likert scale, 5-point Likert scale, whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree with these beneficial statements. Do cover crops increase soil health? Do cover crops help you control weeds? Do cover crops reduce runoff? Do cover crops increase soil moisture? Do they reduce soil erosion? And do they help support pollinators? So essentially, this index gave us how motivated farmers were to using cover crops if they leaned on the side of strongly agree with many of these motivating statements for strongly disagree. So let's see what we found. Now on my y-axis, you can see we have our scale of strongly agree at the top, all the way to the bottom of strongly disagree. And this is just for this region, again, for this mountain region, Intermountain West, Northern Rockies zone. And what's nice to see is that all of the 6 motivating statements we presented to farmers, it looks like farmers primarily agreed with these statements. So most farmers who took this survey agreed with these beneficial aspects of cover crops. And the top 2 were reduced soil erosion and increasing soil health. So we can see that for this, and that's useful in the sense of knowing what is most important in terms of farmers wanting to use cover crops. What goal are they primarily looking for? And we could say that it looks like they agree with all of these statements, but the top reducing soil erosion and increasing that soil health. Now that's nice to know what motivates farmers, but it's also really important to know what are the barriers. So that way, as we continue to build out our outreach, build out research, and build out information on cover crops, what's the biggest barriers we need to overcome? So in a similar fashion, we asked farmers to rank whether they strongly agreed to strongly disagreed with these barrier statements. And we garnered this from the literature as to what are common barriers with cover crops. And we also knew from working with farmers what were common barriers in the West. So that's essentially how we created the questions we asked. So for example, do you agree or disagree that cover crops are hard to establish? Is your growing season too short? Are cover crops expensive? Do cover crops reduce yield in your cash crop? Do cover crops increase disease? I don't have time. I lack the equipment, and I have inadequate knowledge. So the biggest barriers in this region, you can see on the x-axis, we have one being strongly agree, which would indicate someone strongly agrees that that is a barrier in terms of their use of cover crops. And strongly disagrees means it's not really a barrier and it's not impacting my use of cover crops. We could see that the top 3 is are expensive, I lack the knowledge, and I lack the time. And what's important here is that these are things that we can potentially do something about. For me, for example, working in Idaho for many years, short growing season was our biggest barrier. So that's interesting to see that that ranks least or lower on the barrier scale for farmers. And that's something potentially we would have trouble dealing with in terms of how do we plant cover crops in an already short window of time with an already limited rotational option. So what's interesting again is to see that the top three are some things that we can perhaps tackle, whether that's through policy or whether that's through more outreach. And lacking knowledge and lacking time, we know are probably going hand in hand. You might lack the time to spend the energy researching cover crops, reaching out to other people, getting on the internet, opening publications to find out what works for your system. Now, let's look at that same exact data, but look at it for the entire Western region. And this graph is the exact same in terms of the axis and the barriers listed, but what's important to note is that the top two remain the same. Biggest barriers are that cover crops are expensive and I lack the knowledge. Essentially what flip-flopped for third place was lacking time, flip-flopped with hard to establish. Now on the bottom of the barrier scale, growing season is too short and increasing diseases remain kind of on the bottom in terms of being a large barrier to overcome for many producers in the West. So I want to jump into these barriers of expensive and lacking knowledge. So to summarize real quick, motivations, we can say that all of the motivational statements about cover crops seem to be agreeable. Most farmers seem to recognize those benefits, which indicates they're probably more likely to more motivated to grow cover crops. And the top two were soil erosion and increasing soil health. In terms of barriers, it's nice, it's not nice to see, but nice to see that the top two are expensive and lacking knowledge, because perhaps those are some two barriers that we can help do something about. Luckily for us in the survey, we also asked farmers how they access information about cover crops, which ties into that lacking knowledge. Where are farmers seeking information? So if they're lacking knowledge, where do we need to target our information and outreach in terms of cover crop research and use? So we asked on our Y scale, you can see we asked farmers how often they source these various outlets for cover crop information, whether that was often, sometimes, seldom, or never. And the information sources we asked about were the internet, other farmers, agricultural publications, extensions, workshops/conferences like today, university research, field tours, local NRCS, soil conservation district, industry groups, and NGOs. We could see that the bottom two on the right-hand side are industry groups and NGOs, meaning farmers are seldomly seeking information from those sources. And soil conservation district and local NRCS are also on the right-hand side, indicating a least outlet. On the left-hand side, we can see what's ranking high. We can see that the internet is the most highly ranked outlet for accessing information. Second is other farmers, and then agricultural publications. Now, we assume farmers, although they were in the midst of a pandemic and at home, we assume they answered this survey in terms of what do they normally do under normal circumstances, how do they access information. We know internet, regardless, is a pivotal source for all of us in terms of acquiring information. It's easy, it's fast. We don't necessarily know if internet meant YouTube videos. It could have meant publications, blogs, various things like that. But internet ranked the highest, which is not necessarily a huge surprise. But what is nice to see is that second place was other farmers. Now, I don't show this here, but another statistical test I ran was looking at these same access points of information to see how well they predicted a farmer would use cover crops. And in that particular test, other farmers ranked the highest. And that meant that a farmer who more regularly sought information from other farmers were 2.5 times more likely to use cover crops. So it's important to say that the survey indicates that other farmers are an important conduit of information sharing, which Jeremy highlighted. The Western Cover Crops Council is looking to help build out their platform of farmers and ag professionals to help share information about cover crop use in these different climates of the West. So that way we're all learning from each other and learning from specific climates and specific cropping systems that work for us. So I'm going to end a little bit with what about policy? So in the beginning, I mentioned that the federal government pushes cover crops for the various conservation practices that cover crops provide, but that number one benefit being their ability to help stop non-point source pollution. So essentially, why cover crops are such an interesting conservation practice is because they can have a win-win. They can win out for farmers by helping to improve their soil health, helping to improve their long-term soil fertility, but then it has this large-scale societal benefit to helping to improve water quality issues associated with agriculture. Other conservation practices are not such a win-win for farmers, such as taking out land or expanding your riparian zones. Those are all good from a conservation standpoint, but not often great for the bottom line for a farmer. So cover crops are really a win-win and very interesting in that regard because they can have this large-scale benefit, not only for the farmer who adopts them, but also for those water quality issues and other environmental issues. So the federal government promotes cover crops, and some of you might be aware of these programs and some of you might not, but essentially through the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Services, there's a program called EQIP, which stands for Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And essentially incentive is that key word, where the federal government wants to incentivize farmers to adopt conservation practices because of these large-scale benefits we can see. So research has shown that most farmers who use cover crops don't participate in this EQIP program, essentially this cost share program. So we wanted to ask that in our survey to see if we found a similar result as to were farmers in the West utilizing this program. And we want to be able to use that data to help inform that program and that policy so it can be a better tool and a win-win for farmers. Well, first we asked if you were aware of the EQIP cover crop cost share program. And in our survey, we found that 61% said they were not aware of it. Well, you can't really participate in a program if you're not aware of it. So that's good information to know, is that most farmers were not aware of this program. For those who were aware of the program, we then asked, how many years have you participated? And essentially the biggest segment in this pie chart in yellow is 0 years. So 56% of the farmers who were aware of EQIP said they had not participated. And then the second largest pie in this pie chart is the pink, which is 17%, which was only 1 to 3 years. So in general, we can say that most farmers in the West are probably not aware of the EQIP program, and those who are not participating or have not participated for very long, which falls in line with what other research has found in terms of participation in these programs. Now, I don't have as much time to dive into this, but we did ask those who were aware of it and those who had participated, whether that was 0 years or more, we asked, what are some barriers you've experienced with the EQIP program? The largest square in this chart is essentially none. And that's probably those 56% of farmers who have never participated. They don't know what a barrier might be because they haven't participated. But some of the others who have participated, they indicated the inflexibility of the program. An example of that would be Farmers might have an idea of what cover crop seed mix they want to use, but the NRCS won't necessarily approve that, and the NRCS would require them to use their set seed mix. And I think some farmers don't necessarily like that, and they want a little more flexibility with the planting date and perhaps that seed mix. Other barriers indicated in this survey were the paperwork, meaning the time it requires to fill out that paperwork and provide the documentation for the federal government in terms of receiving that essential cost share. Staff still learning was another barrier indicated, waiting time, program clarity, and NRCS has limited resources. So essentially it's hinting at the NRCS staff perhaps needing more funding to promote the program and also make it more clear and effective or efficient for producers to participate in. So this is just a hint at some of the things we found in terms of the EQIP barriers. And why we wanted to ask about that is because, again, we want to help inform this policy. The whole purpose is to help farmers or help share the burden of farmers adopting some practices that they might have to experiment with a couple of years before they really get it down. Well, how can we inform this policy if most farmers are not participating in it? And if they're not participating, what are those reasons? And if we look back at our barriers of lacking knowledge, perhaps some of the cost share funds can be used for more outreach, if that's one of our biggest barriers, in addition to cover crops being expensive. In summary, again, this data set helps the Western Cover Crops Council have a baseline data set of how are cover crops being used by producers in the West? How many producers are using cover crops? What are barriers and what are motivations? And essentially we can say that 70% of farmers in the West have used cover crops or regularly use them. And that's really a good number to see. We know that reducing soil erosion and increasing soil health are the top motivators for this region. And overall, we can say that cover crops being expensive and farmers lacking knowledge being the top two barriers for farmers to expand or even use cover crops in the beginning. And another important aspect that I want to highlight is that farmers are found to be an important conduit of information. And we know that in the past, we know that research has found that farmers spreading knowledge about what's worked for them, what hasn't worked. But I want to highlight that in terms of the Western Cover Crops Council as they continue to build out their farmer network. And for you farmers that are on this webinar, helping spread the word about cover crops, help the Western Cover Crops Council spread the word about what you've done in your particular climate or your particular region. So that way we can eliminate some of the experimentation that it requires for new farmers to find out what cover crops work best for their system. What are the management tools they need to use? Again, perhaps we can reduce that cost of cover crops by eliminating some of that initial experimentation that it sometimes requires for farmers as they get started with this new practice. So with that, I have some time for some questions, and my email is on the bottom of this slide, so you can also email me questions as well.
All right, thank you, Lauren. Excellent information. And that's actually the first time that those of us on the survey team have got to hear the results as well. So it looks like we have a lot of great information to dig into and learn from. So for questions, Jason, what do you see?
I don't know if this question was for the other panelists or for you, Lauren. There was a question about, is there less benefit of cover crops that are tilled up annually versus long-term established crops? But I don't think we surveyed that, right?
No, we did not specifically ask that question, but anyone can jump in if they have.
Well, I know that's a discussion that we at the University of Idaho Extension cover crop team have had for quite some time, and we think that there needs to be some research on that. Certainly, we certainly think that the long-term establishment is better. Absolutely.
Let's see here. There's a question from Cooper Brossi. He says, can you clarify where you sent the survey and how well it represents a full cross section of Western growers. I'm wondering if the survey was mostly completed by those who are already on board with cover crops.
Yes, you bring up a good point. We can only assume that a farmer who's going to take the time to click on a link about a cover crop survey, we're more likely to get farmers that naturally are inclined to use cover crops. So when we say 70% of farmers, or if we want to extrapolate 70% of farmers, we probably need to be more conservative about that, knowing that the farmer that is gonna click on that link is likely a farmer who is interested in cover crops, which means they've probably tried them. So that is one of our limitations that we knew about going into this, and it's hard to try to eliminate that in a survey like this to get an equal share of farmers who might not have any interest in cover crops versus those who will. So that's a good point, Cooper. And then the second question was where we shared it. I'd say the Facebook ads, and also a number of us on the Western Cover Crops Council sent out emails to all sorts of ag organizations. And the Facebook ads I know were a big, I targeted specifically the states in the West with those ads. So no one in another state outside of the West should have seen that ad for the survey. But I will say it was not completely representative of the West. The vast majority of the respondents were in the Pacific Northwest, meaning Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. Unfortunately, in some states such as Alaska or Nevada, we weren't able to get upwards of 20 farmers, whereas in states like the Pacific Northwest, we were getting 150 to 200 farmers to respond to that. So it's not completely representative of the entire West, unfortunately, but we did our best to try to get as much representation as we could.
Yeah, and I would quickly add into that, as part of the team, we sent it out to every commodity group, every farmer organization, everything related to a farmer that some group might have an email list to try and reach as many people in the West. Probably have time for a couple of more questions anyway.
Okay, so Heidi in Alaska asks, can you provide state-specific results, for example, for Alaska?
Yes, I can. Not right on this call, but I think, Heidi, you helped us advertise a survey, if you're the same Heidi. But yes, we can. And I know Alaska was one of our lowest respondents, so it might not be as valuable as a state like Oregon or Washington, where we were able to get 75 up to 150 to 200 farmers. So it's a little bit lacking in states like Alaska, but we can offline. I could highlight what Alaska did provide, at least those farmers that did fill out the survey, because maybe we would see some sort of uniform, if all of those respondents did indicate, one particular barrier, that might be something at least to start with, to build out from. But in some of those states where there's low response rates, it won't be as valuable. But yes, if you emailed me, I could certainly help provide some detailed information per state.
Okay, and one follow-up that goes along with that is someone was asking if they could see the results of those farmers participating in EQIP and how long they have again. And also if it's been published yet. So I would say you could reach out to Lauren and she could help you get access to some of that data once we've finished publishing. And I'm assuming it's being worked on to get this published.
Yeah, and this is really the first time I've been able to, as Steve said, even present some of the data. So we closed the survey in the summer and, spent the fall, cleaning the data up and stuff. And there's a lot of it because we asked 60 questions. So there's lots of interesting information in there. And again, this was just a 25-minute presentation, so just a snippet of it. But we do plan to, I'll present again at the Pacific Northwest webinar series in February. And we do plan to publish through some journal articles and as well as some extension or various outlets as appropriate. So, and if you have any ideas for us for information sharing, you're welcome to email me, and we can, if you're attached to some sort of organization or would like more detailed information, we're open to sharing the data. So.
All right. Great. Thanks, Lauren. Really, really good information. I see lots of questions rolling in. This is one of the downsides of not being able to have a conference live, so that we can continue great discussion at the break or, after the meeting. But again, if you really do have some pressing questions, you can email me and I will pass those along. Lauren shared her email there as well. And so a lot of work yet to be done on this survey as we kind of start to dig into the data. So with that, I would like to reintroduce our speaker for the final presentation this afternoon. And again, I would like to introduce Dr. Matt Yost, who is Agroclimate Extension Specialist with Utah State University, as he discusses water considerations for cover crop use.
Good, thank you, Steve. Let me get things ready to share here. Oh. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Pleasure to be with you today, albeit virtually. I want to talk about some water and other types of considerations for cover crop use. I'm going to start kind of trivially here and ask this question: What is a cover crop? If we were in person, I'd probably ask for some ideas and get a little discussion on this. If you're like me, you're finding that the definition of a cover crop can be quite broad, quite liberal. And there's lots of other terms out there: alternative crops, double crops, intercrops. Are these the same? Are these all the same as cover crops, or are they different? For the purpose of the discussion today, I want to talk about cover crops in the context of the word cover, and pointing to the idea that cover crops are a secondary crop, typically not a cash crop, that would replace some bare ground or fallow. Usually this is in the winter. It can be at other times. And often these happen, or they're used in between cash crops. Cover crops are often not harvested, but rather used to provide cover and other benefits, organic matter, nutrients to cash crops. So this is the context that I want to discuss a cover crop in today. I know there's lots of other applications and lots of other uses. Many people are terming things cover crops because it's an alternative crop or a different crop, or it's a double crop that they're harvesting. And that's okay. I'm not here to hone on this, but for our discussion today, I really want to focus on a cover crop for the purpose of covering the ground and something that would probably leave in the field and not harvest. Okay, so how much, I want to go through a series of questions here. So thinking about cover crops, how much do they cost? Here's just an average cost of many different species. So I went to Green Cover Seed. They have this calculator. It's a smart mix calculator. Great tool. Allows you to go in and select different conditions about your site, your field, your farm, and then give some recommendations for different types of cover crops. So I went in and I picked almost every type of cover crop possible that they were selling seed for, and did this for 4 broad categories: broadleaves, grasses. I've got an error in my legend here, I apologize. brassicas. This first one here should be brassicas. I apologize. Grasses and then legumes. And you'll quickly see that most cover crops cost anywhere from $10 to $20 an acre, except for legumes. They tend to be a little bit more expensive. But legumes also can provide some nitrogen, and so they often return more benefit than some of the other, economically, than some of the other species. Okay, so why might you or I invest in using cover crops? There's lots of reasons, lots of goals that people have when using a cover crop. And so here are some of the top 10. So first, most people are interested in increasing soil organic matter, nitrogen fixation in some situations, nutrient cycling. It's a great way to hold on to nutrients over the winter so you don't lose them, to add crop diversity, and to increase the management of insects, to provide more beneficial insects. Some others, and these are big ones, decrease soil erosion, decrease soil compaction, and decrease weed pressure. And finally, some other goals are to supplement grazing or forage production. Today, I'm going to focus heavily on one of these, and that is increasing soil organic matter. So why is soil organic matter so important? Most of us know that it's important, and know that we want as much of it as we can get, and know that it produces great crops. The more we have, the better our crops do. So why is that? I want to talk about quickly just three reasons why organic matter is so important. One is that it helps to form soil aggregates. And aggregates are critical in our soil. They allow for air and water to get in, to infiltrate, and to move through the soil. And we all understand that getting water into our soil, especially in the Western United States, is crucial. It's important for producing crops and for maintaining the health of our soil. Another reason is that it's a food source for life, for biology in the soil, and for decomposers. Decomposition is critical in soil. It produces gelatins, polysaccharides, organic acids, and these act as glue, so they help hold aggregates together. They also help release nutrients from the soil that are then captured and utilized by crops to produce high yielding and high quality crops. And finally, organic matter helps absorb and retain nutrients and water in the soil. So they kind of act like a sponge. So how much is, what worth or what value does organic matter provide to water holding capacity of the soil? Many of you have probably seen this type of graphic. This is produced by NRCS, that shows that every 1% increase in organic matter can result in as much as 25,000 gallons of available soil water per acre. Now this number is an estimate, and the range varies widely and varies based mainly on the texture of your soil, which influences bulk density and many other characteristics. So keep that in mind. It's a range, but the more organic matter we have, the more water our soil is able to hold. The more water our soil holds, the more is available for plants to grow and utilize, which is also crucial to most cropping systems in the Western United States that are dependent on irrigation, limited supplies of irrigation that seem to be dwindling and seem to be at risk for many factors, including pressure from urban populations, anticipated decreased in variable water supply as changes in climate occur. And so adding and using moisture from the soil is crucial in irrigated agriculture. Okay, so we understand that. We know organic matter is important. We know it's important to increase it. So how do we go about increasing it? How much do we add? You know, organic matter in the soil is a lot like us, a human body. We can't really eat a large amount of food once a week or once a month or once a year and be okay and survive. It takes constant replenishment of nutrients and food to keep us going. And soil organic matter is the same way. It's always decomposing, and so it always needs replenishment. It always needs addition of crop residues, roots, shoots, biomass, manure, other additions, compost, to keep the levels up and hopefully to keep them increasing. And generally, we can't add too much organic matter. The more we add to a soil, generally the better. Okay, so we know organic matter is important. We know we want to increase it. What is the potential? I've heard some pretty outstanding claims, and I'm not sure if others have, but sometimes you'll hear people talk about increases in organic matter, 1% or more increases in organic matter in a really short amount of time. And I just want to point out that usually that is not possible. Usually it takes time, and quite a bit of time, to increase organic matter in soil. Here's just a metric, an estimate that was provided that showed about a 0.1% increase per year is a pretty lofty increase. And to get that increase, this is just in one scenario, it would take about 20 tons of solid dairy manure per acre per year to get a 0.1% increase in soil organic matter. So in 10 years, in a decade, you could increase organic matter by 1%. That's a lot of manure, and that's manure every year. In most of our systems, we don't put that much manure on every year because we have a lot of perennial crops. And so we're putting it on periodically and not annually. And so it just takes time. And most of the time, it will take at least a decade to increase our organic matter by 1%. We'll talk more about this later in the presentation. So what are some of the challenges to cover crops? Lauren covered this quite well in her survey, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but just want to point out quickly, the National SARE program has conducted cover crop surveys for many years. And this is one of their surveys. I think it was the 2015 survey, and it shows where they're getting most of their responses. And much of this is coming out of the Midwest. That's where they've historically received the most responses. And so it's most representative of the Midwest. And usually there's very few responses from the Western United States. But let's see what we can learn from the Midwest. So here were the challenges, the most frequent challenges to cover crops listed by respondents of that survey. And the top three were establishment, just issues with establishing the cover crop. The second one was seed cost, and third was extra time and labor required to manage the cover crops. And then lots of other reasons, minor challenges and struggles to cover crops. Today, I want to focus just a little bit on a few of these. These are concerns that I hear most frequently as I talk with producers in our state, is that the cost the cost of the seed is a huge limitation for them. And then one that wasn't a big factor in the Midwest, but seems to be a huge factor in the Western United States, is the fact that cover crops use moisture. And we're limited in moisture. We often don't have excess, and so many growers are grappling with that trade-off between using water for cover crops or utilizing it for a cash crop. And so those are two that I want to dive in a little bit more to the rest of the time we have together. So I first just want to pick out a couple opportunities. So as I think about cover crops in the Western United States, and realize this is a huge region and there's a lot of diversity in what crops we grow. But one challenge that we have is that we have a lot of perennials. Well, I don't know if it's a challenge. It's a blessing, actually. We have a lot of perennials. Alfalfa and grass hays are dominant. They cover more acres than almost any other crop in most of the Western United States. And as perennials, there's less opportunity for cover crops and probably less need, right? Because perennials are covering the ground usually all year round. And so it provides probably less opportunity for us to incorporate cover crops than other places like the Midwest, where it's all mostly annual based crops. So as I think about it, I want to just pinpoint a few opportunities that I see, and realize that I'm not going to cover every crop, every system, but here are a few. So in my view, one of the largest opportunities to utilize cover crops exists when small grains are in a crop rotation. The reason for that is that small grains are a short season crop, right? We're not using the whole growing season. So small grains are typically planted in the winter or in the spring, and then we harvest them sometime in July or August, which then leaves about half of August, all of September, and the rest of the year that we have opportunity to get a cover crop established, get it growing well, get high yields of that cover crop before winter sets in. So in my view, that's one of the largest opportunities, is when we have small grains in rotation. This could include irrigated and dryland settings, and especially probably in some dryland settings where we actually have fallow. We have a year of fallow where we have no crops growing. But that also presents even more challenges as it relates to moisture. And Dr. Earl Creech will cover kind of all things dryland cover crops when he presents next week. So I won't talk about dryland. I just want to focus on situations where we have irrigated cover crops that we might utilize after small grains. A second opportunity that we have is following corn silage. Corn silage, most of the corn in the Western United States is used for corn silage. Much more corn silage production than in the Midwest, where the majority of the corn is produced for grain. What that means is that silage corn is usually harvested earlier in the year than grain corn. It usually comes out in September, sometime in September, which allows for just a little bit more time for us to get a cover crop established before the harsh winter conditions set in. And so in many ways, this provides some advantages. It gives us a little bit more time to get cover crops established, because that's a huge battle. In the Midwest, I spent 8 years researching in the Midwest, and that was just a massive challenge. Trying to get cover crops established after taking grain corn off is very difficult, because there's not much time to get the cover crop germinated and growing before winter sets in. A third opportunity could be after some of these later season crops. So sugar beets, potatoes, mainly in Idaho, but also some grain corn. Most of these are harvested in late September to early mid-October. And so there may, if we can in some areas squeeze these in, there may be some opportunity to incorporate cover crops after these crops are taken off as we move into the winter. I'll just mention really quickly, another maybe advantage that we have here in the Western United States is that our growing season sometimes starts just a little bit later. It doesn't warm up as much until we get normally into early to mid-May. And so it also leaves us a little bit more time in April to let cover crops to let them grow a little bit longer before we might terminate them in preparation for a cash crop. Okay, I hate doing this. I hate providing a lot of equations and but I think this is really important. And so I want to walk through this with you, and please don't get lost on equations or calculations. But I think it's really important to kind of walk through what the potential is for cover crops to improve organic matter. So earlier I talked about that 1% increase in soil organic matter. And there's some areas where NRCS and others are kind of setting this as a goal, or as an option for farmers to try to focus on over 10 years to try to improve your organic matter by 1%. And so I want to kind of walk through a few scenarios to just show you what it looks like and what might be possible. So please stay with me here. So the first scenario is just a situation where we had a cover crop following a small grain. And so in this scenario, let's first just look at, we're gonna quantify how much carbon we can get from the cover crop, and then also from the cash crop. So in this example, we're following wheat, and we're going to put a cover crop in after our wheat. So we are getting carbon from our cash crops because we're leaving some residue, right? We always leave the roots, and most of the time we leave some straw or residue. So for wheat, just quickly calculate how many pounds of biomass, how many pounds of crop are we going to leave. So first we can just look at the grain yield, and we estimate we get about 8,000, and realize I rounded some here. So if anybody's got their calculator out or punching these out, don't, because I slightly rounded to make it easier to follow. So we got about 8,000 pounds of grain. The harvest index of wheat is about 50%, so that means we have about 8,000 pounds of straw per acre. Roots are generally about 20% of the biomass, so we get about 1,600 pounds of roots. So if we leave the roots in the straw, we get about 9,600 pounds of biomass that's going to be left in the field. Okay, so now we add a cover crop. So the cover crop, we're going to say we get about 5,000 pounds. This is all kind of on a dry basis. So we get about 5,000 pounds of above ground material, shoots, and about 1,000 pounds of roots. So we get 6,000 pounds of biomass from the cover crop. So we add those together, we have about 15,000 pounds of biomass per acre. And the carbon content can vary, but let's just say it's about 40%. So if about 40% of that biomass is carbon, then we have a little over 6,000 pounds of carbon per acre that we're going to add to the soil. And keep in mind now that 1% organic matter in soil could be somewhere around 20,000 pounds of carbon. This is assuming we have about 2 million pounds of soil in an acre furrow slice. So we need to add an additional 20,000 pounds of carbon to increase our organic matter by 1%. Now, all of that carbon that we add is not all going to turn into organic matter. In fact, only a small percentage of it actually sticks around and is converted to a more stable organic matter. And so we're going to assume this ranges, usually it's about 10 to 20%, but let's just assume about 15% of that material becomes carbon that sticks around and becomes organic matter. So we take 15% of that, that's about 1,000 pounds of carbon, which is about 5% of the required 20,000 pounds. So it's going to take about 20 years if we're just doing our normal crop rotation, returning normal residues, and we add a cover crop. And this is a non-harvested cover crop. It may take about 20 years to increase our organic matter by 1%. Okay, now many people like to remove cover crops because they cost quite a bit to use and include. And if you can get a short-term return on that by harvesting it as forage, either mechanically or putting cattle or livestock on it to graze, then we're removing quite a bit of that shoot, or nearly all of the shoot material. And so now we've reduced our carbon input from the cover crop down to about 1,000 pounds, which reduces the total carbon input. And so now in this case, we'd only have about 3% of the required 20,000 pounds per year, and it might take about 33 years to increase organic matter by 1%. Okay, one more scenario. So let's just look at corn silage. If we were to put a cover crop in following corn silage, let's look at what that would be. So I simplified this just for ease here. So if we had 9,000 pounds of grain, 9,000 pounds of stock, stover, we would have about 3,500 pounds of roots. But this is corn silage, so we're removing all of this, or nearly all of this. And so we have about 3,500 pounds of input. Same cover crop. It's just this, in reality, this is probably a little bit less because we can't get as much biomass following corn silage, but let's just keep this for sake of comparison here. So 3,800 pounds of carbon with the cover crop and the silage corn roots. This would be about 570 pounds, so about 3% of the required 20,000 pounds that it would take to increase organic matter by 1%. So again, about 33 years. So these are just a few scenarios. Realize that there's lots of caveats. There's lots of variation in some of these estimates and numbers. But I just wanted to give you a sense of what's possible, how long it might take if we're just looking at adding cover crops into a rotation. So in that first scenario where we followed small grains and we used the cover crop, we said it might take about 20 years to increase organic matter by 1%. So if we just say that cover crop cost us about $20 an acre, over 20 years, it might take about $400 an acre to increase your organic matter by 1%. That's quite a bit. It's not as much when you spread it out over time. And it's not as much when we receive some possibly equip or other support or supplements to help cover that cost. And I think that's what most farmers have already or realize, is that it's quite expensive. It's quite expensive to incorporate cover crops, and it's hard to bear all of that cost. And by adding cover crops, it might be providing other benefits. And so it might be something that others can help society and industry and others can help invest in. Now, I do want to point out just a few other things. So that's just the raw cost, the cost to get that carbon and to increase organic matter by 1%. But realize too that there's also lots of other things happening. There's lots of other benefits that could be happening from cover crops that are going to buffer that $400 per acre over 10 years to increase your organic matter. And some of these things could be nutrient retention. If you're not losing as much nitrate or you're holding on to some phosphorus or potassium, and that's going to help, might reduce your fertilizer costs. You might also be getting some nitrogen from fixation if you're using legumes, so that can help offset the cost. And that in some cases could be quite significant. If you're getting 30 or 40 pounds of nitrogen from a cover crop, that's $15 or $20 an acre that you could save in nitrogen fertilizer costs. Herbicide costs are another thing to factor in. It can reduce herbicide costs, and in most settings that I've seen, it doesn't reduce it by much. People usually still, most farmers still usually need to use herbicides in non-organic settings, and so it often doesn't cut out a full herbicide application. Also need to look at the cash crop. Many people report cash crop increases. Keep in mind too that it can, and in lots of cases can reduce your cash crop yield. And the reduced erosion, and this is huge. If you're in an area where erosion is a big issue and you're holding on to soil that's not being eroded, the value of that is tremendous and will really help offset the cost of the cover crops. Quickly want to just show you another factor here. So cover crops alone can be quite expensive, can be an investment, but sometimes when coupled with other things, it really helps offset the costs. And here's just an example from some work that I did in Missouri, where we looked at using cover crops and no-till over about 20 years on one of these research fields. And what we noticed there is that, yes, cover crops were adding quite a bit of cost. It was about $40 an acre. So this was to seed and for the actual seed. But we saved a ton of money by reducing tillage. So cutting out tillage almost perfectly offset the cost of using a cover crop. Reduced, and most of that was just reduced fuel by running tractors across the field. So in this study, I just wanted to show you really quickly, over that 10 or 11 year period, when we added reduced or no tillage and cover crops together, we had a small impact on our crop yield. There was a few areas where we saw, in orange here, we saw some increased yields, a few areas we saw decreased yield. We had changes in some of the variation in the crop yields across the field. But most importantly, as we looked at profit, we maintained it. So over about a decade, so we had about a decade of using cover crops and no tillage, we maintained profit in this field, which, you know, is not the most appealing message, but it was a really important message for us that it's probably possible. And this was a soil in Missouri. It had about 2% organic matter, so it's not a 5% or 6% organic matter you might find in Iowa. We were able to maintain profits because we offset a lot of the cost of cover crops with no tillage. Okay, so a question I want to end on, and one that I think is critical in some areas of the West, are cover crops worth the water investment? Because for some people it's going, well, keep in mind that cover crops use water. They have to have water to grow, just like any other crop. And so in some cases it's going to be a trade-off, and we may have to sacrifice some water for a cover crop, or sacrifice water we'd use on a cash crop for a cover crop. And is that worth the investment? And that's a really difficult and challenging question to answer. And I'm not going to provide all the answers today, but I just want to show you really quickly here. So in that example that we used with wheat in a cover crop, that first scenario I showed you, we said that it would take about 20 years to increase organic matter by 1%. So if we take that 20 years and let's just multiply that by how much extra irrigation we might use on a cover crop. And if we were using, this is also hard, I had to make an assumption here. I just said if you were putting a cover crop in following wheat or another small grain in mid-August, that you would probably irrigate it 2 to 3 times the rest of that season. So you might use somewhere around 6 acre inches of water to get that cover crop up and established following the wheat. So if you did that for 20 years and realize you're probably not going to grow wheat every year, there's going to be other crops rotated in there. But for this sake, let's just say 6 acre inches over 20 years would equate to about 10 acre feet of water to increase your organic matter by 1%. Now, if we go back to this metric we looked at earlier, so if every 1% organic matter had about an extra 25,000 gallons of available water, that 25,000 gallons would equate to about 0.08 acre feet of additional water storage in the soil. So a huge difference there, right? It requires a lot of water to increase organic matter. Organic matter is going to help, but it probably is not going to offset the water that it required to gain that additional organic matter. And this is complicated. And there's lots of variations and caveats here. And so I just want to point out quickly that we are trying to study this and really look at what is the water use of cover crops and other soil health promoting practices like no tillage and diversifying crop rotations. And so we have a large study in place right now at three sites in Utah where it's a water optimization study. And so we're looking at the impacts of cover crops and how they influence water use in the short term and hopefully also in the long term. So to end here, just want to summarize. So first, cover crops alone will likely take about 20-30 years to increase organic matter by 1%. It really depends on how much of the biomass we remove. The important point is that cover crops alone, it's going to take a long time. If you incorporate cover crops with other practices like large and frequent manure or compost applications, or grazing to get more manure out on the fields, or eliminating tillage or other factors, then people have documented that you can do it in about 10 years or a little bit less. You can increase your organic matter by 1%. Realize that cover crops in many cases will likely require an investment in additional water. And so if water is tight and it gets even tighter into the future, it will be critical to optimize water use for cover crops the best way possible. And one thing that will probably help in many cases is to utilize rainfall, precipitation, snowfall as much as possible. So if you can get a cover crop in and let it germinate with rainfall in the late fall, you're going to be in a better situation water-wise. So look for every opportunity you can to kind of save on water, because it will take an investment. And like I mentioned, we do have some ongoing research on this, and so stay tuned. In the next year or two, we should have some really good results on kind of really specifics for cover crops in our area and region, and how they influence water optimization. With that, I'll say thanks, and I think I've gone a little long. I apologize. So if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to take some questions.
All right, thanks, Matt. I think in the interest of time, we'll take one question, and then if folks want to stick around for a few more, because there actually are a few there in the question and answer. And again, if you need to leave early, we've dropped that survey link in the chat box. If you would please take a few minutes to fill that out, we would appreciate it. So, Jason, what's our first question?
All right. Jonathan Hogue asks, is there a trusted soil test that can be used to see what is happening in the soil while using cover crops?
Great question. Lots of different tests, soil tests that you can use. In the Western United States, the jury's still out. You know, there are some national soil health tests like the Haney test. Cornell has a soil health test that they use, and it's used in many parts of the country. And those are probably some of the two most popular, what we call soil health tests. They're measuring lots of different properties. We haven't used those tests a lot in the Western United States. They are starting to be used, but we still need more information on them to see how well they work in our region and area. So a big thing, and where I would start for most producers, is to monitor organic matter. It incorporates a lot of other factors and is one of the most important. And so that's what I typically suggest for growers. If you're not regularly monitoring soil organic matter, I would start there, and then you can get more complicated and look at other factors, other measurements of the soil.
All right. Let's see the next. Oh, did you want to say something, Steve? Sorry. Okay. The next question is, where did you get the estimated 10 to 20% conversion of plant carbon to organic matter from? What factors caused this to vary?
Good question. That kind of a published book value. Trying to remember, I think I found that through Extension, my state Extension website. Lots of things would influence that. The type of biomass is really important, the C to N ratio of that biomass. The texture of your soil, the biology of your soil, the general health of your soil, all those things will really influence how much of that carbon is how much of it remains and how much stays in the soil and how much is converted from that biomass. So those are a few of the factors, but yeah, there are a lot of factors that influence that. And so the biggest piece of advice is to watch it in your conditions in your field, get good measurements of organic matter, and then repeat those measurements and really monitor it closely and see what you're.
So with that, I'd like to thank all the presenters for their very informative presentations. I found them all quite interesting, and I trust that you did as well. Appreciate you hanging around. If you have a question that didn't get answered, please email me at shines@uidaho.edu, and I'd be happy to pass those along. And my email was in the chat box a little earlier. Again, please take a minute, fill out the survey located at the link in the chat box. Just click the link and it'll take you to the survey. And again, we appreciate your help. We look forward to seeing you next Thursday, where we start talking a little bit more on the grounds type of research. And so thank you and have a great afternoon. And thank you to all the presenters.